En allt er góð.
Er það heill?
Núna er spurning, get ég ekki bara fengið svona nælu eða?
Jú.
Þetta er eitthvað,
That's what I thought. You wanted to let me, right?
I just didn't listen to you.
Yeah, I know.
Það er bara betra. Hvað get ég verið frjáls með hendurnar? Þetta er fram. Tveir.
Did you get it? I just want to make sure it's in your inbox, and then you can check it. Because now. Let me open my email again. Maybe it didn't. I didn't wait long.
Mæka með þér? Já. Hvað segirðu? þú fyrir hennar kaffilíu?
Ég eftir kaffilíu. Hún var... It's gonna be fine.
Yes. It's
Ég þarf að ég ekki.
Nei, þú ert ekki eftir Coffee and Clean.
Ég ekki með hann Buffett sem skilja heilt sér.
Nordic House.
Ég þarf bara að byggja þetta. Það er líka fyrir ykkur basic. Já, en málið er...
So what shall we do? Shall we talk?
We're gonna start now.
Takk fyrir að koma. Thank you all for joining us today for Riff Talks presented by Trickshot. This is a series of presentations by established creative film professionals who are willing to share their knowledge of how to break through. We're here to explore new trends in our ever-changing and evolving film industry and shed light on new technology, new distribution models, and new ways of thinking. In addition to, of course, tackling all things filmmaking from concept to completion. In the spirit of TED Talks, Riff Talks aims to educate, inspire, and motivate, and possibly challenge decision makers to reflect and rethink. I understand this is the first time that this event is held by Riff, so hopefully this is the first edition of countless more to come. Our speakers today are a diverse, accomplished, and inspiring group, which I will introduce in detail before each takes the stage. Producer Katja Adomeit from Germany will talk about unconventional distribution. Producer Davíð Óskar Ólafsson from Iceland will speak about how to take your company to the next level. Writer and media artist from Lebanon, Zina Abiasi, will discuss new media for everyone. Writer-director Þórður Pálsson from Iceland will give an overview of how to turn a pitch idea into reality. All things sales and distribution will be discussed by Gabor Greiner from Filmsboutique in Berlin, and Jakob from Gutek was busy, so he's off the table today. Nanna Kristín Magnúsdóttir will talk about, Nanna Kristín, writer, director, producer, actress, will discuss being multi-talented or simply admitting to being an efficient multitasker. And last but not least, one of Iceland's leading environmentalists and advocates for Icelandic nature, Ómar Ragnarsson, veteran journalist, filmmaker, and television presenter, will discuss the environment and cinema. But first, Davíð Óskar Ólafsson will come to the stage, but I'm going to tell you what he's accomplished so far. He's an established Icelandic producer and director, started young and worked his way up to becoming one of Iceland's leading producers. Since he established Mystery Productions in 2006, he has produced 6 features and 2 TV series. His films have traveled the world and premiered at festivals such as TIFF, Sundance, Berlinale, and beyond. His TV series Fangar was one of the most watched television shows in Iceland, as was nominated for 16 Edda Awards. His latest television series, Valhalla Murders, is the first Netflix original series coming out of Iceland and will be released early next year by Netflix. He has directed the film Bach, also directed 2 episodes of the Valhalla Murders, and aims to balance his producing and directing in the future, according to Davíð. Gjörðu svo vel.
I guess I'm the first Riff talker. So I'm supposed to be talking about a little bit how I came to be what I am today, a producer, having survived the industry now for, 18 years? I started young. I started being in my mom's editing room when I was 6 and 7, and then it went on until I finished high school in Denmark. And I said to my mom, I need work. I need to do something over the summer. And she got me into a Danish movie. I grew up in Denmark. A Danish movie called, can't even remember its name. Anyway, I was a runner, and having my experience today, I would probably have fired myself a couple of times. I came in young, 18, didn't really know what I was doing, thought it was easy. Filmmaking is easy. It's not, and I learned that even more as I went along. And I got through my first production. I realized by myself that I probably didn't do the best of jobs on that production. So I asked my mom again, can you get me another job in Iceland? And she did that. But then she said, it's done. I'm not going to help you anymore. And my mom is Valdís Óskarsdóttir, editor. And she said, you cannot use my name like ever. Like this is as far as I go. And I was like, all right. And I worked on a movie called Niceland by Fredrik Thor. And I was the key PA. I ended up also being the assistant location manager on that one. After I finished that movie, Zigzag asked me to stay with them as a junior producer. I said no. I didn't wanna do that. I wanted to go to school. So I applied for the European Film College in Copenhagen. No, in Ebeltoft, Denmark. I didn't get in because they said I was too qualified. After being a runner on 2 movies, I don't know. With a little bit of pushing myself up the waiting list, I got in. I finished that school, and after that, I got a job again in Denmark, and almost didn't get it because I did so poorly on my first production in Denmark. So it was still hunting me. I met with Árni Filipusson, who is my partner today at EFC. When I finished the movie in Denmark, I went back to Iceland and I started working for Zigzag. And I did a short film with them, and I was I don't know, maybe a little bit cocky at the time. I said, this is easy. It's not that difficult. So I called up Árni, my partner now, and said, let's start a company. We can do this. So in 2006, we established Mystery Productions. It was me, Árni, and a friend of ours called Hreinn, who's not with us anymore. We didn't really know what we were doing or what we were gonna do. So my mom, again, she's gonna be coming up a little bit, she had an idea for a movie, but she didn't wanna write the script. And I was like, okay, what it's about? It's about a couple that's going into the countryside of Iceland and getting married, and everything goes bad, and I want to do Dogma. I was like, okay, let's do it. And we got together a group of actors from Vesturport, who is a big theater group in Iceland. And we had them help us develop the characters. We got Guðrún Edda, who's a producer in Iceland as well, to help us find financing in terms of private equity, because at that time the Icelandic Film Center did not, and they still do not, give money to unscripted projects. We went out, we shot the movie in 6 days, 4 cameras. It was a mayhem, and a lot of fun, learned a lot, and then we dumped it on the editor's computer, and my mom was like, who the fuck is the director, and why is she not thinking about the editing? And funny thing is, she was talking about herself, and then she ended up editing the movie. We ended up premiering it at TIFF. I was 25 at the time. We came to Toronto. We had Fortissimo as our sales agent. And being young at such a big market was weird, because I felt that nobody was taking me seriously, like nobody. We had meetings and they were like, where's your mom? And she's right there, but she's also my director, and like, you know, so it was kind of a weird situation to be in. But it did well, the movie, but it didn't do too well. And to be honest, I'm quite happy about that. Because going into and doing a huge success as your first movie, you don't learn about not succeeding. So taking it step by step, for me, made me, I think, appreciate the good stuff. learn by the bad stuff, and realize that something works and something doesn't. We kept going. We did another movie directed by my mom. Then we went out and did our third movie, Either Way, which was almost a no-budget movie up in the countryside of Iceland. Again, just what? Okay. We just kept on going, and I think that what you as a filmmaker, you should always strive to push yourself, right? You should always try and do better. You should always not be afraid of failing, because my God, you're going to be failing a lot. I don't have a count of how many times I've heard the word no. I know that I've given the word no a lot of times to filmmakers as well. But I think that if you strive to do as well as you think that you're capable of doing, you will succeed. It doesn't have to be in the terms of money. It doesn't have to be in terms of festivals. It doesn't have to be that you won all the awards. Your success is pretty much getting it from the paper to the screen. And you're going to be learning all the way through. You're going to be failing, as I've mentioned before. But at the end of the day, and it's a cliche, it's not that you fell off the horse. It's about you stood up and you kept on going. I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm young. Yes, I know, but I've been in this business for 20 years. It doesn't get easier. It doesn't get easier by your success. There's always a hurdle that you have to overcome. There's always a sales company that you have to get on board. There's always financing that you have to get on to make your movie. You're not a billionaire who just throws money into your production and you get it done. Filmmaking is and will always be a team effort. It's not the director alone. It's not the writer alone, and it's not the producer. It's a team effort of people that are burning for the same desire to say the same thing through that movie that you're doing exactly at that time. You can look back and say, well, why did I do that? Well, it made sense at the time. And I think that if you're willing to run onto walls, cry, bleed, sweat, whatever, filmmaking might be for you. But if you're not, I would just do something else, because it is difficult. It is not a job. It is a lifestyle. And it will be with you until you die. And it is something that I'm super happy that I got involved in. And I hope that the people out here are not going to be giving up, throwing out ideas that might be something sometime, because you never know. And just keep up the good fight. And I'm out, apparently. I'm done. So.
Takk fyrir, Davíð. Thank you so much, Davíð. I think maybe if Davíð has more to say, there's going to be a break after, so maybe you can talk to Davíð, because I think he would have needed more time. Next, we're going to discuss unconventional distribution. Katja Adomeit is a German producer based in Denmark and Germany. She loves the creative and financial side of producing and is in constant search of new ideas that matter in different processes during the development and production. Katja is known for Wolf and Sheep, The Orphanage, The Weight of Elephants, Pine Ridge, Loving Pia, Force Majeure and The Square by Ruben Östlund, Team Hurricane, and many others. She has worked in a number of countries, Afghanistan, to name a few, Russia, Ukraine, New Zealand, and beyond. She has established and owns Adomate Films in Denmark and in Germany, where she produces international fiction films focusing on art house projects by young filmmakers from all over the world. Here you go. Thank you. Go over. Thank you.
Hi. But I'm based in Copenhagen. I have an eight-year-old company in Copenhagen and a 2-year-old company in Germany. I started producing in 2012, and since then I have produced around 20 feature films, co-produced, produced also documentaries, some documentaries. And I was concentrating to work with the directors who are also scriptwriters and who are young talents from all over the world. So not only from Denmark, but I also work with a New Zealand director and an Afghan female director. And I was like kind of obsessed. Now I'm maybe obsessed with something else, but at that time I was obsessed with festival films, and especially like creating different processes in script writing, in development, in production, in order to achieve like different results of films, and to kind of bring something new to the table than the old traditional way. So I just from each project to each project, it was always a different new process we created. So, for example, the film Team Hurricane, which is a debut feature film by a Danish director and scriptwriter called Annika Berg. She writes scripts in a non-traditional way, and Team Hurricane was like aimed to be a film for teens, and aimed to be a cult film. So the way she writes scripts is actually she writes scenes, but in the scenes she puts YouTube links or pictures, or especially for that film, because it was for teens, also GIFs. And so you would read maybe scene 1, then there's a little bit of action description, and then there's like a YouTube link you have to look at, or there's a picture of this is how I imagine the dog in the film, etc., etc. And this is how you have to go through the script. It was a low-budget film. The film was made for 3 million Danish kroner. And the way we presented it to the film commissioning editor at the Danish Film Institute was by creating a web page. Of course, it was not a public web page, but it was a web page where you could read basically the script, and so the GIFs could also be probably looked at, and instead of like having a PDF, for example. But then you could like see the cast, pictures of the cast, the videos that the cast made for us, or we gave them some video tasks that the cast had to do during a workshop, or the locations. And even before we did the first application to the Danish Film Institute, we created a document that included basically all our ideas of how we can reach that audience and how we can make this film cult. Because we knew, okay, this film is going to be crazy. It's going to be like all kinds of different formats and colors and really crazy shit. And teens are not going to buy a 12-euro ticket or 80 Danish kroner ticket to go to the cinemas. Teens we can only reach online. So we have to kind of like break the holdback. We planned from the beginning that we're gonna have a day and date release, which means like an event screening, and go online straight away. But this document included also all kinds of other ideas, like physical things that we wanted to produce, podcast ideas. So, like from the very beginning, even before we made the application to the Danish Film Institute, it was like, and constantly during the 2 years of development and production and post-production, we kind of like massaged the ideas, bounced more ideas, deleted maybe some, maybe new came up. And then it was in May 2017 when I heard that the film was selected for the Venice Film Festival. It actually, everything came into place because we wanted to kind of create a buzz in Venice and wanted to create to have that buzz like follow into the local Danish premiere in Denmark, which we did like a couple of days afterwards. So buzz from the press. So the film has like 8 female teens in it. So we invited them all to Venice. We did like a big show, big red carpet show with them wearing crazy clothes, and we had ID and Vice, and everyone was covering them getting ready for the premiere, and so we tried to, hype it a little bit up. At the same time, we had a deal with the Cinemax complex in Copenhagen that they can fill that whenever there's a screening room filled up, which was like it was a one-day event at the cinema, but whenever there is a screening room filled up, they open another screening room, so we can just basically fill up the entire complex if possible. In the evening in Denmark, after the screening, we had like a huge concert with all the artists that gave us the music for the film at a communal church, which is like a really cool church, like very well known in Copenhagen. And we did, for example, pearl plates event at the church. So we invited teenagers to come to the church and put pearls on plates, and then you iron them, and then they could take it home. We did competitions where teens could submit their video art, and we had a deal with the Modern Art Museum Charlottenburg in Copenhagen that they distribute the winner. So in that sense, we came up with all kinds. We made like goodie bags, like gym bags with the title on. I could just like go on and go on and go on because it was really like a lot of work, and it was basically divided between the director, the producer, me, and then one assistant. And we did have like a distribution company connected as well, who helped us with the deal with Cinemax, because it was like also a special deal. But I think like that if you do like unconventional films, then maybe even if you do more traditional films, then I have to kind of come up with my own kind of distribution strategy and kind of different ideas how to marketing, social media campaign these films. Yeah, that's basically it. How many minutes have I got? 3. No, but that's it, basically.
Thank you very much, Katja. Next, we will listen to Þórður Pálsson, Icelandic director who just finished the Valhalla Murders. Þórður will talk about bringing a pitch idea to reality. Þórður graduated from the prestigious National Film and Television School in London with an MA in directing, 2015. His graduation film Brothers has won numerous awards. Following graduation, Þórður won the coveted Nordic Talents Pitch Prize. In 2016, his project The Damned was chosen to take part in the Nordic Genre Boost, hosted by Nordic Film and Television Fund. He is currently in development with Film Film Brothers Productions, is this correct? And Elation Pictures. Þórður is now in post-production with Valhalla Murders, produced by True North, Mystery, and RÚV, which is the Icelandic Broadcasting Network. It will premiere in early 2020, or?
Premiering in Iceland over Christmas now.
Over Christmas, okay. Þórður Pálsson.
Yes.
Thank you. So from pitch to reality, that's kind of a hard thing to describe. So, but basically, yes, we've just almost finished the production on my first TV show that I created, which was a very interesting process. And that all started with one pitch. I had a meeting with Kristen, who works at True North, and with the owner of True North. And I'm going to go back now and kind of talk through how kind of my pitching, or how I became the pitcher that I am. Is that kind of in my childhood, I grew up in a video store. My grandparents had a video store, and I wasn't really the kid that was kind of always out playing football and stuff like that. I was just hanging out there, and I can watch all the films that I wanted, but not the new ones. It had to be the old ones. They had to rent out the new ones. Yeah. So I was always around stories, and I loved also telling them the stories that were in those films. So afterwards, they'd kind of give me the time, and they'd listen, a kid retelling a film that they'd already seen. And that's kind of where it all started. And I was kind of lost in my teens because I knew I loved film, but for me, everything about film was the actors that you watched on screen. So I thought, okay, I really want to be an actor. That must be it, because I love this medium so much. So in high school, I did all the plays, the musicals, and everything, and got okay as a performer. But then there's a point where you look at the other people with you on stage, and you see how much better they are than you are, and you make a decision that maybe this should not be what you should be doing with your life. And then there was this huge moment that happened to me just before graduating. There was this little thing, little course that you could get extra points to graduate. And they were teaching you how to make short films. So I said, oh, very interesting. Also, nice to get some extra points. And I went in there and fell in love with the medium. I fell in love with how to tell stories. I made a couple of short films there, which kind of helped me also because I was kind of lost in what I wanted to do. And I applied with the Icelandic Film School in Iceland. And with those short films, I got in and just made loads and loads and loads of short films, but wasn't really being taught how to tell a story. It was kind of just go out there, do what you want to make. And it didn't really change how I kind of perceived and learned how to tell a story until I went to a film in England called the National Film and Television School. And there, the question is always, what is this story about? Like, no, I know what the narrative is. I know what happens in it, but what is it actually about? And my tutor always used to swear. He said, what the fuck is this story about? So that's kind of a thing that I always take into when we're writing or a writer's room. What is it about? Not what's happening, but what is it about? And in that school, it wasn't until, I think, maybe second year, which was quite late, that one of my friends said, because we had to pitch to get a crew. So basically, we had to get up, we had to show a story, and supposed to be concise and telling what the story was about, and then you could maybe get the best DP or best writer or best whoever in that. But I, for some reason, thought you had to tell them beat for beat what happened in the whole film. So people were falling asleep while I was telling them beat for beat, every page. So I started trying to learn how to condense a story. How do you tell it what it's really about? And then I was quite lucky that I was eligible to take part in the Nordic Talents. And in the Nordic Talents, which is a pitch competition, they give you 2 days where they teach you literally how to pitch. Like, don't look at your feet. Don't move your hands too much like I'm doing right now. It's nice holding a pen, you know. A pen kind of distracts your hands a little bit. Never in your pockets. And they really helped me with those 2 days in learning how to try and keep eye contact with people when you don't really want to be doing that. But that's like one of the key things. And through what they taught me, and also taking a feature film, condensing it into 5 minutes, and trying to understand what is the main element of your story. And another thing that just happened naturally with me, obviously this is kind of just my journey into pitching, is that because of the drama background that I had, I, for some reason, was pitching a story, but I'd somehow always kind of jump into scenes, and I'd act a little bit like this, and it really helped people to visualize what I was saying, and people would get into a story. And often different types of stories need different kind of pitching. I pitched a horror film, so I decided to actually talk quite, low. I was just trying to get the audience in. So it was all kinds of different versions of pitching. And basically, after I'd learned that, I got an idea for this TV show. And but as you know, in the industry, things move really slowly. So I needed to get a job at a cocktail bar because I thought, oh, great, I'm going to learn how to make cocktails. It'd be great, be like Tom Cruise, brilliant. No, they said, no, you're going to be working at the door. You're going to learn nothing. So I was okay. So I was at the door, and then slowly but surely, every day, I was meeting all these people, and I had to be kind of like, sorry, I can't let you in, you don't have the right shoes, and this and that, and then, oh, give me a couple of minutes. And then I just started to use my time, because this was like a year. I started pitching these people my stories. But I think some people were just polite, and just because they just wanted to get in, they wanted to be nice to me. But I could see, you can gauge when you look into people's eyes, and you can see when you kind of drift off a little bit. And also, the more you pitch, you cut the fat off. So like what I've learned is tell everybody your stories. Anybody, your grandma, your mom, are people getting it? Are you really focusing on the right elements of the story? But the more you say it, you're going to cut out that thing that you thought was so, when he runs into the house or whatever. Don't need that. So that's kind of one of the things that really helped me. Just also in all kinds of filmmaking, just keep on making stuff, but also just keep on telling your stories, because the people that hold the stories way too close to their chest, and they don't let people, often people shoot the wrong draft of their film. Like you did not get enough people to read your script, thus you're shooting something that with scenes that are not ready to be shot. So I think always show it. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of how it was. And then I was just very lucky to get a meeting with Kristen at True North. And after having told hundreds of people at a cocktail bar how I saw the story, I did the same thing over coffee. And then the owner of the company said, great, when are we starting? And that was quite weird to hear in a meeting. And then we had some more meetings, and we kind of narrowed it down. After that, we had to pitch that idea in other places for funding and to get people on board. And I think my journey, having gone through obviously love of film, but also doing some of that drama, and always just kind of trying to get the best version of the story out by telling it over and over and over and over again. That became my technique. But also, I have dyslexia on a high level. So like this might be like the most boring part, but I'm going to get into it, like how I actually pitch. But I could do that later, but I have time, so I might just do it now. Like I want to get as much of the story and what I really care about out there straight away. So the first thing that they taught me was the body language, the way you walk in, always be holding a pen or something, never put it in your pockets. But the main thing was that I learned that I wrote down freehand on a piece of paper because it helps me with dyslexia to remember what I'm going to say. I write it down, and then after writing it down, I type it up. And after I've done that, I can never read it again. That's what I put down, and then I put that piece of paper in the hands of someone. Sadly, it's always been my mother that has to help me with this. Maybe my wife in the future, who knows? But yeah, the person that I trust the most, sitting across from me, and I spend a whole day. I just stand there, and I'm doing it over and over and over again, almost like an actor would do to learn his lines. And in the end, slowly but surely, you're getting your lines down. But the main thing is, also, you're doing it in a foreign language, it's English. So I wrote it down, but I didn't want to try and remember every word. So I said, okay, if I'm kind of getting it, if I'm getting each beat, if I'm kind of getting it down, that's close enough. And then by having 3 or 4 different versions of a word in English really helped me because I've done it so many times. I was just so afraid if I'd always trying to do it verbatim what I wrote down, I would falter. That one word I can't get it, then I can't keep on going. And also just having these beats within how I pitch really helped me. And also this psychological thing, I would always have it written down in my back pocket if everything should just go really badly. But the main thing is you cannot pitch with a piece of paper in your hand. That is like a big no-no. You should know your story. Like if you don't know your story, then who does? So yeah, that's that's what I did with Kristen, and that's what started the whole TV show, and we're premiering this Christmas, and yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Takk fyrir Þórður, thank you very much. I have a pen, but I have a paper though. It was very inspirational to hear this. We have to take a break for a little bit now. We're going to do coffee and some snacks outside, compliments of Trickshot. Next, after the break, we have Zina Abi Assi with the New Media for Everyone. We have Nanna Kristín Magnúsdóttir, who will talk about being multi-talented or an efficient multitasker. We also have Gabor Greiner from Films Distribution to talk about distribution. And then Omar Ragnarsson, who has been awarded the Green Puffin Award 2019. So please have a break, and we'll be back in 30 minutes.
Jesus Christ.
Strákar, þetta var geggjað.
Ja, ja.
Ómar, þetta stíg á svið og held smá kynni.
Running, I will be in the 3 minutes, I will be like this.
We were using it for the event before this event.
Is there an alternative? Super tough. Like, we have it super time.
Yes, it wasn't here.
It was here. Now it's not.
Ja.
Ok, ertu tilbúin eða? Good afternoon again. We're about to begin. We will begin in a few minutes. Next on stage is, let's see, I'm going to use my glasses because I'm not 25. Next on stage is Iceland's leading environmentalist and advocate for Icelandic nature, Ómar Ragnarsson, a veteran journalist, filmmaker, and television presenter. Ómar has just been awarded the Green Puffin Award here in recognition of his decades' work of filming Icelandic nature and advocacy on behalf of the environment. The Green Puffin is a Lifetime Achievement Award that RIF presented this year for the first time. For decades, Ómar Ragnarsson has dedicated himself to the fight for nature protection and has altruistically offered unmeasured work to the cause. Icelanders are in great debt to Ómar, who has tirelessly devoted time and efforts to the cause of Icelandic nature, even going so far as to having been arrested for his work, passionate work for activism. Takk fyrir það, Ómar. Please give him a warm welcome.
Just a moment. To prepare, can we lift this? Take it down. Podium. Very good. Empty podium. It begins with drama. Oh, okay, thank you very much. Yes. Dear comrades, it's good to be here. I was asked to just explain why I went into this field of filming and documentaries. I was 8 years old. The first telephone came to my grandma, and I saw the book. And in the book was a map of Iceland, a map of the world. It became the most influential book in my life. You know, the Bible and Profiles in Courage by John F. Kennedy, number 2 and 3. Because it showed the world, it showed my country, and I became a nerd about geography and people, like some of my relatives even were. They were, most of them, nerds. The brother of my grandma, he knew every figure in elections north of the Alps since 1945. It usually was knowledge about, not relevant things. But it became an avalanche. I became an entertainer, 18 years old, and had to go to places all over the country. And the small airplanes were best to be fast. And then I got the license to fly my own airplane. They learned about it in the new from the television that I could fly, and I was a nerd that knew everybody in every place in Iceland because I was entertaining all the year, all over the country. So there I began first in sports, and then it was a snowball that became an avalanche. So I will not dwell with that because I want to talk about nature. Why are it's worth something to fight for nature? People say you should fight for people, not nature. But I say we are fighting for nature because it is for the people. Without nature functioning, the people can do nothing. So fighting for nature is the best way to fight for people, for the benefit of the people. And now there's a roaring protest of millions of youngsters all over the world who are rallying against the inactivity of the world leaders who achieve nothing against the exploitation of the world's resources, and they achieve nothing against man-made climate changes. If this revival had only been 20 years sooner of the young people, 1 year ago it would have been unthinkable. The battle is beginning, my friends. Never has mankind been in more desperate need for awakening than now. Yes, need for a different tomorrow. Different tomorrow. That's a slogan we have seen in RIF this year. Never has the world needed more the power of good media and filmmaking and the needed support, encouragement, motivation, and reward for young talents. For young talents, this is for young talents, for the young people, because it will be for all people to fight for environment. When watching brilliant documentaries in television like the BBC series about the solar system and the planets, not only one is feeling overwhelming veneration, smallness, and worship facing creation of huge and endless universe. It's so immense, but also feeling a humbleness, smallness, and deep respect for the magic of brilliant documentary films. They're still making documentary films and making drama films about the World War II because it's so dramatic. Now, the war for the nature of the world is even more dramatic. We have endless places to go to and to explore for our mission. Græni lundin, the green puffin, is a symbolic bird. But in Icelandic, Græni lundin is very similar to a slogan that was found around the Græni lundin. That is the Icelandic word Græna lundin. Lundin is a thinking. The green thinking, Græna lundin, is the green good thinking, based on the simple reality that we only have one earth because we don't have another. It can be expressed in a poem like this. Only one earth because we don't have another. Its goods and resources are limited. Beware of that, sister and brother. Only one earth, plagued with harsh exploitation, resulting in wars and suffering, hunger and destitution, hurricanes, floods, and weather extremes with impact on every nation. Only one earth. In dust storms, its life is ailing. Its resources will run out and nothing be left if short-term greed is prevailing. Only one earth. Scary is mankind's blunder. The law of nature is brutal and hard and hits you like hail and thunder. If you kill the earth will kill you. And bleeding, you will go under. But yet only one earth can dress us and feed like a mother. If we are determined to save its life and protect its sister and brother, loving our only earth because we don't have another, only one earth. And I would like to end my address by playing a music video presenting a kind of an encouraging manifesto for the greatest challenge of our times, the battle for life on earth through energy exchange. And the lyrics are in English to emphasize the joint Herculean effort of all mankind and all human beings on the planet. Video is shot in Germany, Austria, Ethiopia, but mostly on a simple journey on L-bike in the unique environment of Iceland, nature, with Yoko Ono's Peace Beam in Reykjavik as a symbol. Let's see what we hear and see.
To a fight that must be won. We are the generations that start cleaning up the earth. We are the generations that should give new vision birth. Skirting over obstacles up every slope and hill, with ever-growing endurance and strengthened faith and will.
With power from clean energy, we light the brightest beam. With power from our deepest hearts, because we have a dream.
By using all our wits and guts, we sweep through storm and rain
To undertake enormous tasks, defying weariness and pain.
Let it be done. Fighting spirit and fun. Bicycles on the run. Father and mother, daughter and son. Electrical bikes for everyone.
Inevitable energy exchange.
Across the ocean, over valleys thundering through the sky. To promised land of love and peace, our minds are flying high. Sustainable development shall prosper everywhere. From the seabeds over continents, up through the atmosphere.
We are the rangers pledged to save the nature of the earth.
We are the generations that shall give its life new birth. Let's rinse the water, clean the air to give us healthy breath. Fighting for environment against its bitter death. Let it be done. Come on, let's have fun. Cars are on the run. Father and mother, daughter and son. Solar cars on the run. Mission and fun. Love and peace for everyone. When the battle is won, food and health set and done. Human rights for everyone. Life on earth on the run. Let it be done.
Tack fyrir þetta, Omar. Thank you very much. That was amazing and way ahead of his time. He was doing this decades before it was in. Now environmentalism is in, but he was way ahead of us. Next up is Sina Abi Assi. She's a writer and media artist from Lebanon. She is the director of interactive programs at Tribeca Film Institute, where she blends her background in graphic design, digital media, creative writing, to creative programs that focus on the power of incubation in emerging media. with experience in the Middle East and North America. Her work moves between cultural criticism and fictional poetry to investigate the complexity of culture, technology, and politics. Her work has appeared in the printed anthology Arab Women Voice New Realities. She is a mentor at New Inc., the New Museum's cultural incubator in New York City, Sina. Please welcome her.
Presentation, I know we weren't supposed to, but it's hard for me to follow rules. So again, my name is Zena Abiasi, and I'm the Director of Interactive Programs at Tribeca Film Institute. And today I want to talk to you about immersive media, what it is and who is it for. Before I start, I just want to get a feel of the room. Who here is a filmmaker? Yeah, that's awesome. Who here is a producer? Sound editor. Wow, no sound editors. Editors in general. Sweet. Who here is a creative technologist? I knew it was a far-fetched idea. I just still wanted to try it. Who thinks they are a storyteller irrespective of what their profession is? So today I want to appeal to the storyteller in all of you. So what is immersive media? At the heart of it, immersive media is, where should I direct it? New ways of telling stories. As simple as it is, it's a new set of tools, it's a new palette for storytellers to tell new types of stories. Over the years, we have called this new medium many things. We've called it transmedia, web-based, interactive, and in 2019, we seem to have landed on immersive and emerging media. But they all mean one thing. They mean that your audience is now invited to be involved in the story. So you're immersing, you're really dipping the audience into the story rather than giving them like sort of a distant whiff of the experience. What happens next? So this is quite an example. It can be anything from moving your head around to clicking around to really engaging in the narrative to push it forward. Even if it is a new form, it is inherently very human. It is appealing to the audience in a more evocative, emotional, and ultimately personal way. Technology has heralded so much of this new movement because it's allowed us to imitate and recreate natural human embodiments and interactions. So immersive media is not tech-based, but technology is a big part of it. So what are common forms of immersive media today? One of the most popular among filmmakers is virtual reality. Virtual reality is ultimately putting your audience in a headset, completely removing them from their immediate surroundings and putting them in a whole new world. In that world, they have a point of view. In some cases, they have an avatar. They are a character in the narrative. And sometimes you're just looking around and experiencing the world. And sometimes, as in this image, you have actual authority within the narrative. Another common form is augmented reality, and that most of us, we have it in our phones, we use it on a daily basis. Instagram stories, Snapchat, put on a filter, have like cat ears, but it's truly a layer of media overlaid on your immediate reality. So it doesn't remove you completely, but it brings a new reality on top of yours. Another form is data visualization, or another way of explaining it is a true partnership between machine and man. We pump data into an algorithm type of machine, and it creates from that data a type of visualization, type of a narrative, a type of story. And this, I moved on. So anyway, another form that I really, it's maybe my favorite form of immersive media is immersive theater. And ultimately, it's analog. It's not tech-based, it's human-based, and it suspends the stage all the way to the end of the audience. And you're in the set. You are not watching the set. You're not necessarily always a character, but you are involved in a more interactive way with the characters, and that can be them actually dancing on top of you. They're no longer dancing at a distance. They're dancing very personally to you. Installations, spatial storytelling. You walk into a space and the space is telling you a story, and that can be tech enhanced, it can be analog, it can be papers on the wall, it can be you cutting papers and hanging them on the wall. So it has many, many variations, and oftentimes a lot of the previous ones are presented in installation form. Who is it for? Who's creating immersive media? And who's experiencing immersive media? Now, if we look at the industry, even if we want to believe that all media is for everyone, we start to see a repeating pattern of mostly men. Not a shocker. It is the very bare obvious, and I will state it because I take every opportunity I can to state this. Because we've inherited bad habits from film and tech industries, it is very natural and obvious that the industry is largely dominated by men, and white men in particular. And you know, when I first started in immersive media a couple of years ago as a writer and a designer, I truly believed that immersive media is the medium for the people. It's a medium for people whose narratives and histories are not linear, for stories that do not fit in the traditional canon of film and literature and art. It's a medium for communities, for people all over the world to take complete ownership of their stories, of their environments, of their geography, of their climate. But ultimately, we fell into that trap. And why immersive media? Why should we enter that space at all? It's truly because stories about people crossing borders in search of a new life, and stories about female divers in Korea, and stories about our climate, as we just heard, we need to push through tradition to really create impact in the audience, to really get our audience to feel that they are involved in these stories, that actually my daily life impacts people's lives all over the world. And we see that especially with the climate crisis today. What do you need to create immersive media? And then we've heard some of this today, and this is why I tell you I want to appeal to you today as a storyteller, because you don't need much to create immersive media. I mean, of course you need some stuff, but ultimately you need a great vision and the need to tell a story in a new way. And I'm going to let my 3-year-old cousin demonstrate the next things that you need to create immersive media. The first thing is curiosity. You don't need to be curious enough to know everything about virtual reality. What you need to be curious about is how virtual reality can be leveraged to tell your story. How can you leverage this new approach to storytelling to enhance the experience of your story? Second, you need a great team to put together an awesome birthday party, but also, and this was mentioned earlier, a great team because you're not expected to have all these skills yourself. Most of you in this room are filmmakers. Your job is to go out and find a creative technologist to collaborate with on these projects, an architect, a musician, data analyst. Well, you get where I'm going with this. Filmmaking is a collaborative approach. Immersive media is a collective approach. Everyone has ownership over the project. There is one vision, and there is usually a couple of headliners of creators, but it is a collective endeavor. And it's hard in that sense, but the rewards are amazing. And finally, that happened at her birthday. You need to want to fall and fail and repeat, and we heard that, but failing in immersive media is not an option, it is mandatory. This is where a lot of innovation in the tech space is born. This is a lot of where innovation is born, period. Today on the stage, we heard a lot about some failures and how people picked themselves up from that and went on to create masterpieces. You need to be willing to fail and fail quickly. It's not one cycle of failure, it's many cycles of failure until you get to the point where you have a product, and I say product, and when I say product, I mean project. When I say project, I mean a story, and that story is able to appeal to a very large audience. That's a lot of the work that I do at Tribeca Film Institute. We have labs and funds and incubators that are seeking to open up that space, to pump in new talent, to diversify who has a complete command over this new media, because we cannot afford to repeat the mistakes of the past or the mistakes of the previous industries. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zina. That was very interesting. We are now going to hear from Nanna Kristín Magnúsdóttir. She will talk about being multi-talented or an efficient multitasker. Nanna Kristín, writer, director, actress, producer, is an Icelandic, yes, writer, director, producer, and one of Iceland's most well-known actresses. Her films include Heartstone, Paris of the North, and Excel as an actress. She is the founder and owner of Cubs Productions. Nanna Kristín graduated from Vancouver Film School in screenwriting for film and television. In 2014, her debut short film, Playing with Balls, premiered at TIFF. Cubs, her short film as writer-director, won Best Short Film at RIF, the Icelandic Edda Award, Flickerfest, ECU, and many more. Nanna Kristín has been nominated for the 2018 Nordisk Film and TV Fund Prize for outstanding writing for Stella Blomqvist, an Icelandic television series. She just finished a new television series, which she just named to me. Say it after. Happily Never After is the title. It will be on RÚV, which is Icelandic Broadcasting Network, on Sunday, and the next, I think, 6 Sundays, I believe. And she just showed it in Bíóparadís, and it looks really fun and hilarious and amazing. Welcome, Nanna Kristín.
Is it on? Yeah. Hi, thank you for inviting me. So yeah, multi-talent or multitasker. Well, I think I am both. There's so much I wanted to talk about today, but I think I will focus on this TV series where I am writer, director, producer, actress, marketing director now because we have a premiere. And why. And I also want to get into focus a little bit on how I made this as a woman. I think today we think that women's rights have come such a far way. You know, we are in such a great place in Iceland, but we're not. We are in a great place compared to Africa, but not how it is supposed to be. You will see when I talk along. Yeah. So I had a vision. I had a story. I wanted to make a TV series about a completely normal woman and a character-driven TV show, not plot-driven. So what influenced me was Lena Dunham from Girls, the creator of Girls. For me, she opened my eyes for how you can show women on TV. You know, they don't have to be perfect shape, and also they are allowed to want sex. They're allowed to be horny. They are allowed to make mistakes. They are allowed to be bad girlfriends, and they're allowed to be human. Not that I made an Icelandic version of Girls. This Happily Never After is about a woman, 38-year-old woman that has 3 children. She's a couples counselor, and she finds out that her husband has been unfaithful And that's the drama that came later. I first created the character, and then I wanted just everyday life, but you need some drama. If it's not plot-driven, you have to have some drama, and it's a TV series, it's entertainment, and yeah, your husband being unfaithful and then divorce, that's a lot of drama there. But okay, I had an idea, I had a great character, so then I had to pitch this idea. Okay, the idea is 38-year-old woman, and the drama, okay, man unfaithful, and what else? And I'm just like, you know, the drama, who's gonna pick the youngest one up from kindergarten? And it's like, that's not really drama. It's like, yeah, in my life it is. It's really, you know, we fight over this. And it's like, it doesn't really come over. You should maybe, this is maybe like a woman's point of view, so you should get a man with you to write this. And I was like, okay, you know, you smile and you're, yeah, oh, great idea, man, yes, of course. Okay. And then it's like, yeah, you have to have, you know, another point of view. And so, you know, you just take it as it is. So I thought, okay, you know, don't get insulted. So I thought, well, maybe I should then get another woman's voice and a younger woman, because I feel that I'm belong to a generation that is starting to get like old. And I came to that conclusion when Free the Nipple was. I was like, oh my God, those poor girls, they're just like, you know, having their breasts all over the newspaper, and like, what are they doing? And now I'm so thankful for these girls, you know, but it took me a while to get the point. So I got another writer, a younger woman, to write with me. So I got, you know, we started writing. Then I wanted to direct this and play the leading part. Why did I want that? Not that I'm the best actress in Iceland. No, it's also, okay, I just said that I was the best actress in Iceland. Well, I'm not, but I'm one of them. I'm one. But yeah, I wanted to do this. It's because I wanted to challenge myself, because I wanted to write about this not perfect woman, but as an actress, that was kind of, for my ego, like a huge challenge, like, oh my God, I have to, you know, there are sex scenes and naked scenes, and this character is not the perfect mother, not the perfect friend, and it was difficult to make this character believable. So that was one side of it. I wanted to challenge myself as an actress, and then also because I'm a producer also on this TV series, and you know, TV series are not just like, okay, get an idea and everybody is just flowing on in creative, you know, flow. No, we have a budget, and we have like, you have to, yeah, follow the budget. And I thought that would really be good for me to be the leading actress and, you know, know my lines, know the story as a director, and, you know, you don't have time to go, okay, now I have a sex scene, I really have to like get myself together and breathe into it. No, the budget says, you know, you have 35 minutes to do this. So I thought, yeah, I can ask that of myself. Then I got, okay, great, director, but you have to get someone with you to direct. A man. A man? Why a man? You know, and I had some women directors, and I was like, why not this one, this one? It will be like, it will not sell, you know, because then it's just women's point of view, and, you know, you have to have balance. Okay, I smiled and just, yeah, you're right, yeah, balance, yeah, that's good, balance. And so I got a good friend of mine, a great director, with me. And I chose him because we had a talk, and I asked him, are you willing to go into my creation and into my vision, you know? Because I have a vision, and it's very clear. And And I was very honest, and I said, there might not be much room for your vision. But I wanted him to direct me, of course, because I'm the actress and the director. And of course we talked, and what he came with was a lot about like how the cameras, what cameras we should use, and a lot of solutions, of course. But as a man, I don't know, a woman could have made the same conclusions and solved the same problems, but it worked out. Then I'm trying to find Carolina because she's going to tell me 3 minutes. No, there you are, okay. Okay, then produce. I had to produce. Of course, you have to have a production company, established production company. Okay, I talked to some production companies, and they didn't really buy this idea, the pitch. And I totally understand. I mean, you know, nobody dies, and when I pitched it, everybody dies in Scandic Noir TV series. So nobody dies. There's no like winter or snowing or anything. But there's sex. I mean, sex sells. But there is maybe not more, it's more like fucking, you know? And yeah, people are afraid of that. They want sex. They want like, you know, the hand going down the window. That's not what I wanted to show. I wanted to show realism. So, remember, you know, women are allowed to be horny, you know? That was something that I thought, yeah, that's freedom. Okay, so I owned a small part in a production company, and I thought, okay, I'll go with them. Not to get too personal on that, but it worked out. But in the end, when the, what should I say? The investors saw what I had done, they said, you didn't need that production company, you could have done this yourself. And I was like, yeah, that's what I told you in the first place. But, okay. This with a production company, great production company, but there was also, it would be good if it were men, because I first announced that it would be another production company that was run by women. No, they thought it would be better if it was run by men. You know, this is, okay, it took me 7 years to make this, but this was just like 3 years ago. You know, we are not that far ahead in women's rights. Okay, so I made this I made this TV series. It was great, it was fun, it was a lot of people who were on my team, in my cast and crew, men and women, didn't really matter, they were all great. Now I'm promoting this TV series, and one of the first questions I get from journalists are, how did you do this with all those kids at home? I have 5 kids. Well, I have given birth to 3 kids. I have 5 at home and 1 that's 23. And I really want to just talk about my work. But what I get is that you're a mom. How do you, don't you feel bad when you have to go out in the morning and go to work? And where were the kids when you were working? Actually, I cast 2 of them in the series. So that was kind of, yeah, that was problem solving. It was for 2 reasons. Yes, time, because, you know, the preschool just closes at 4:30, so then I could take them to work. But also because I want this all to be natural, and I'm maybe, you know, playing this leading character, you know, just on her underwear, you know, and doing all, you know, homey, mommy things. And I could not ask children or parents of other children to let the children see everything that they had to see. So I just put that on my children, and I will have to pay for like psychiatrists in 15 years. But yes, so this is the journey of my TV series. This sounds very dramatic, that I'm really maybe angry, but I'm very happy. I'm so happy. And, you know, we had premiere. Riff was great to decide to show the first 2 episodes. Everybody was very positive. But I just wanted to tell, to shed light on that it is a journey and it's difficult. And because we saw, you know, all the men with the, you know, it's everywhere. We love men, don't, you know, I love even white men, I love them. But, but you know, it would be great to get room for a white woman, a blonde, blue-eyed, small woman, yes. So thank you all, and if you want to talk or anything, I'll be outside afterwards. Okay.
Just talk about your work, like what you do, so that sorry. Tack fyrir Anna Kristín. Thank you so much. It was inspiring and somewhat enraging and familiar, and all these strange feelings being a female filmmaker. Very familiar stuff. And do you have another screening of your series here at Riff, or? I think it was yesterday. Okay. Yes. Yeah, but you can watch on Sunday nights. Those who are here. Yes. Do you have subtitles?
Doesn't Rule have subtitles?
Maybe.
I think so.
We'll call.
I sent them English subtitles. So.
Call Skarpi.
Call Skarpi.
So next we have a sales agent. We can talk about gender and sales of film. That'll be an interesting topic. Gabor Greiner is a sales agent. He studied cultural management in Vienna, Birmingham, and Chicago, and worked first as a journalist and film critic. From 2003 till 2009, he worked at the media program for the European Film Commission's Film Fund, which was created to support the European audiovisual sector. In 2009, Gabor moved to Match Factory, which is a sales company, where he handled acquisitions. The films he supervised received 2 Golden Bears, a Golden Palm, and 2 Oscars. Since 2010, he has been responsible for the acquisitions of new projects for Films Boutique in Berlin, sales company. Founded in 2008, the company specializes in sophisticated art house films that have won numerous awards from international film festivals, including the Golden Lion, Golden Bear, and Camera d'Or at Cannes. Gabor is going to tell us about his work, and then we will do a bit of a Q&A. We'll bring up Katja and David to talk about selling films. Gabor.
So my name is Gabor Greiner, and I work for a sales company that is a French-German company based in Berlin. The company is in its 10th year now. I'm there since the 2nd year. And what we do is we try to give a big visibility to art house films from all over the world. So my job in this is the acquisitions part, which I find is also the most exciting one. So I go to film festivals, to markets, to co-production markets, to work-in-progress presentations all over the world, and try to find talents. We are actively looking always for new talents, so first-time, second-time filmmakers. So this is a big part of the lineup. And for this, it's festivals like Riff that make it possible for me to meet as many of you as possible, and to really find what is the voice of the future. To talk a little bit about the girls-boys situation in our office, I'm the only guy, and it's on our lineup we have approximately 40% female filmmakers. This is something that is not, we have never planned that, it just happened. It's probably also because the films that we like are coming from girls or women. Maybe I can tell you a bit about what a sales company is doing. I don't know how familiar you are with the activities that we have or that we are doing in order to support you as filmmakers. Because on the one hand, of course, we try to help you already at a very early stage. So when you are still in development before shooting of the project, what we can do is to give you an appreciation on the international level on what we think is the international potential of your project. And we can advise you on maybe softening a couple of scenes that could make the future of the film more difficult on the international market. Usually we say that the film should be shorter. It's true that for a sales agent, an ideal length is somewhere between, I would say, 80 and 105 minutes. Anything above that is becoming more difficult to sell. I don't say that we don't work on 2.5 hour or even 8 hour long films in black and white, and they still can work sometimes, but it's a special effort. So this is what we do at a very early stage, and then our real work starts from the moment when the film is in production. So usually what we do is we make a mailing. We are in constant contact with the distribution companies, with festivals that we regularly work with, and we keep them updated about the projects that are upcoming on our slate. I think for festivals, but also for distributors, it can be quite helpful to rely on the sales company's pre-selection, because especially with the arrival of new media, new ways of filmmaking, it became much more, I don't want to say easy, but maybe more accessible for anybody to make films. And it also has the effect that there are a lot of films out there, so the competition is huge. So somehow we have to make sure that the distributors and the festivals, they are interested in our films, which is becoming more and more difficult because there are so many other films. So what we do is we tell the distributors and festivals about, we try to tease them, we try to make them interested already at a very early stage in the project. And then once the film is shot and you are working on the post-production, we are starting, of course, the lobbying at the festivals. So the big job of a sales company is also to secure a strong festival premiere for your film. So this is, you should not think that this is your job as a producer. It should really be the sales company who is making that possible, especially because the premiere festival is very, very essential for the whole career of the film later on. So for us, when we make up the festival strategy, it's really strongly relying on this festival premiere that needs to be in the right festival. This is the part of the job that I also like a lot, because this is where you can play festivals also a bit against each other. So if you know, and this is, of course, most of us, we know the programmers at these festivals, and so we can somehow modify the storytelling in order that some festivals are more interested in the film than they actually should be. And then we secure a good festival premiere for your film. I can say that the films that we work on, I would say 95% of the films premiered in one of the top A festivals. There are big differences between festivals. So for us, not every A festival has the same effect when it comes to the world premiere. So the strongest ones, where we can rely somehow on the festival selection alone, that afterwards the sales will work, are of course Cannes, the Berlinale, but not all sections. Sundance more and more, Venice, and Toronto for the North American market. But these are really the festivals, the only festivals that in one way or another guarantee kind of a success for the film. I don't say that if the premiere of the film is in any other festival, like in Locarno or in Carlo Vivari or even in Tribeca, it doesn't mean that the film will fail. It just means that we have to work harder in order to give visibility to the film. Because, and here actually a distributor was supposed to stand next to me so that we can have a little conversation about why they are so picky. But as you can see, they are not very reliable. And this is valid on a daily basis. Somehow we have to make distributors interested in the film. And this, as I mentioned before, so it's getting really more and more difficult. This is where it's very important that when we make up our sales pitch, it's really, it has sometimes not much to do with the film anymore. It's more about what we know the distributor is looking for. So we really try to, I don't want to say manipulate, but we are maybe focusing on something else, which is probably not the essence of the film. That's why you should never be there when we are talking about your film. And you should also never be in a market screening that we organize of your film and where nobody cares about looking at the screen, just checking their mobile phones and coming and going all the time. But this is really part of the business, so this is how it works. We have to find other ways to make the film interesting to the distributors. Festivals are an easier prey in a way because also there is more and more festivals. So the films that most of us are talking about here, so art house films, have also somehow shifted in the past years over to a festival audience rather than a real theatrical audience, which also means that we have to rely more and more on the festivals, that they are going to play the film. This will still cause a lot of trouble for us and we as sales companies, so we have to also adapt to that in the future and somehow try to find a different way of operating. And maybe this is the right time to bring somebody else on stage, a producer, why not?
Stage and hear their perspective on selling films. You can have this one here. Is this on? Yeah. So, yeah, David from before, Katja and Gabor. I just have a quick question to begin with because I'm also a filmmaker, so my film has been sold. But I wonder when we have a film at a sales company, how do we know that our film is getting enough attention, competing with all of the other films that you have? You have, how many films do you have per year, for example?
So we are working, we have a very small lineup, so we are working on 12, 13, 14 films per year. There are big differences between sales companies. So one advice that I would give you, and this goes to the producers among you, you should really do your homework well. So try to find out as much as you can about the different sales companies out there. There are not so many, so it's not such a big deal to go on Google and put international sales and check which are the companies that are coming up, and go on their website and check which films they have been working on the past, to see also whether your film fits their catalog. So this is the first step, and then also it's a very good question because it can happen very easily that your film gets a bit lost among all the films on one lineup. So of course, one thing is to know about the type of films that the company is working on. So you should be, you should like the films that the sales company has on the lineup. And at the same time, this is the first question that you should ask before signing or getting in bed with a sales company. How many films they are working on at that particular moment, because the company should really be there for your film and should not work on maybe a film from the same region at the same time, because in that case the films can even be in more competition than they are already with all the other films. So this is something that is up to the producers. So you should spend some time also with the sales companies that you are considering and try to get to know them, because afterwards it's a long process. So you are going to spend a long time. And this long time is between 5 and 12 years usually that you are somehow locked with one company, with one film. So you should not make any mistakes there.
And Katja, because you use kind of unconventional ways to promote your films and possibly sell them, do you feel like the sales companies are innovative enough in the way they promote the work?
Yeah, I think so. But a lot of the work, like the alternative marketing ideas and the execution of it, is more on us, the director and the producer and the filmmakers. I think. I don't know how you, but I was just in Toronto as well, and we did an alternative marketing idea where we put posters up for a missing rabbit, because we have a rabbit, like a lot of rabbits in the film, and it was like the director, me, and an assistant going all over Toronto putting the posters up. It is just an example, but it's also maybe too not serious enough for a sales agent.
Film? So they were doing their own work and you were doing this kind of guerrilla style.
On purpose, I didn't tell the sales agent about that idea. So I just did it, and then I got an email from the sales agent who got a picture from a distributor, from an American distributor, sent, and she said, "Cool, nice idea, great way."
So that took credit for the work?
No.
But Gabor, how would you feel if we were working together and I would do my own guerrilla marketing campaign that you did not know about? Would that be a problem?
It would be a problem if you don't know about it, because it just so we are super thankful if you do things like that, because at the same time, so don't forget that your film is most of the time not alone on the lineup. So there are, especially in a market like Toronto, most of the sales companies are working on 3, 4, 5, some even on more films at the same time. So we simply just don't have the capacities for going so deep into every single campaign. So we are really thankful for every opportunity. But we should know about it, because it's true that if a distributor afterwards comes and says, "Oh, but what a lovely idea," it's not that we want to take credit, but it's nice if you know about it at least.
But I have to say, to document, so they could read all the ideas up, and also we had meetings about it with the international press and marketing, where they didn't show up. Yeah.
You should never work with that company.
But I know you have some strong opinions on. Do you feel like you need a sales company for your work?
Well, I think it depends. I think we are, as Gabor came in on, we are in an environment that has become much more open than it was before. Like, if you are a veteran producer, you probably know many of the distributors yourself through the movies that you've done with the sales agent before. I think it's maybe for us doing a film in Icelandic that goes abroad. We have maybe a handful that have done something financially on a worldwide scale on sales, and I think it's a little bit difficult to see that you get a sales agent, and we've never worked together actually, that puts in a contract. We're taking 25%, 35%. There's a cap of 100,000 euros. plus marketing cost, plus this, and plus this. So that always it kind of like feels, all right, that my movie that we fought for and we made is financing the sales company's market. Like you go to Cannes, Berlin, Toronto, Venice, there's a lot. And you have, your company has 12 movies that you're working on a year, and adding that up to a marketing cap of 100,000 per movie, let's say, just hypothetical, you know, yeah. No.
So this, again, it depends on which company you work with, but this is, you are talking about the distribution expenses that the sales companies have per film, and this is, more realistically speaking, somewhere between 25 and 35,000 euros. So,
but then if you get into an A festival, there's an added cost to 20,000 euros extra for it. Okay.
Good point, because you have to be very careful about this before signing a contract. At the same time, you have to know as well that if you are in one of the A festivals, then usually we take an international publicist to take care of the press work, which is the best job in the whole world, in my opinion, because they charge like 10,000 euros for a work of 1 week per film. So there are really these kind of expenses. One market screening, for example, in Cannes costs 2,500 to 3,500 euros, depending on which day the screening is taking place. So it's also not something that we make up. But it's true that there are sales companies that try to rip you off with that. And if I may say just one more thing about your question, whether you need a sales company, I say more and more to producers that don't take a sales company. It's much better if you take care of the film on your own. When it comes to films that are not so obvious for the sales because they are maybe a bit more experimental, the subject matter is a bit more local, so the film will have a life in the festival circuit, but maybe will not be sold. In this case, I always say don't go to a sales company because they will just take away the screening fees that you can get from the festivals. It's much better to hire me because it's still a lot of work to reach out to all the festivals, then to follow up with the festivals, then submit the materials to the festivals. So don't underestimate that, but it's not a job that you really need so you don't need to study that, to send out screeners to festivals and then send an email asking how they liked it. But you need time. So maybe you are better off if you hire a person who can do that, and then in return you keep all the fees that come in from the festival screenings. So I don't say that you.
Yeah, I'm not saying that everybody's out there to rip you off. It's not what I'm saying. I'm just pointing out that, as you say, there are companies that are doing this, and this is their their way of doing business, and that's how they finance their company, and that's why they have 25 pictures in their catalog. And like as you said as well, you get lost. Like you don't get anything out of it. And then people start to wonder, like Vimeo On Demand, when it came out, it's not the best platform at the moment. And then there's YouTube, and then there's and you get money for putting your money on your movie up on YouTube. It's like maybe 40,000. If it's hit a lot, it's like 40,000 a year. And it just keeps on, like there's so many platforms. So I just want to, like, do you feel that the sales agent is becoming like a dying breed? Like, are you worried about like where we're going?
Worried only about the fact or the side of our work that as we are working now, it will not be like that in the very near future. Also with the arrival of the SVOD platforms, with Netflix, Amazon, it changes a lot. Of course, once again it depends on the sales company and also on the philosophy of the company that what the company wants to achieve, because for us, we also consider that we are still fighting to make cinema survive and to keep these theatrical releases possible. So for us, it's always the first and most important part of the deal that we make with the distributors, that the film gets released on the big screen. So we are only working in the first line with theatrical distributors. Of course, if afterwards it's for one reason or another we don't find any distributor in a particular territory, afterwards we go to the secondary channels. And I must confess, we also love to work with Netflix, because not only because they pay very well, or they used to until recently pay really a lot for the films they acquire, but also because it gives an amazing availability for the film. So it's everybody has Netflix at home. So alone the fact that and despite that we never hear back anything from them, so we and this is something that will probably never change. You don't have any reporting, so we don't know how many clicks the film had, how many people watched it. You don't hear about that at all, but the film is available in so many households that and we always have this conversation with the filmmakers, because for us it's also important that the filmmakers are happy with our work, and that they that we want the same thing. So especially with first-time filmmakers, we have this conversation. If Netflix, for example, wants to buy their first film, because in this case they have to give up on all this adventure of going to festivals to see their film on in festivals, but also on cinema screens, and it's something that probably you don't want to give up. But so far, they always said yes once they heard how much money they will get in return. Everybody said, okay, with the second film, I make the experience.
With your films, when you decide on which company to work with, which sales agents to work with, what is kind of, what are the concerns and what are the deciding factors in terms of who to collaborate with?
I really think is the most interesting part that we're discussing right now is like really looking at the project and who is it for? Is it like a pure festival film, or is it a film that can actually sell to distributors and being released theatrically, or is it a film that is something for Amazon, or is it something for Netflix? And I think that kind of like I have my focus on right now, because I think like in the past I was really producing art house festival films, and they premiered in Cannes and Venice and Berlin, and yeah, that was cool. But now I'm kind of like obsessed with keeping the vision of a film, but like from early on put ingredients into it so they can bridge over, because I really want to seen by a lot of people, and that could be either sold in a lot of countries or straight to Netflix or Amazon. I know this is not what you asked for, but this is what I really wanted to say.
When you work with the director who says, my goal with this film is having this film in the cinema. Yeah. And how do you deal with the director who says, I want this to be a cinema film, and you say, well, Netflix has this amazing deal, all this money, and the director says, well, that's not cinema. How do you, negotiate that?
Well, I'm not negotiating with the director, because we're just like talking a lot about it from the beginning. But for example, I have the case at the moment where we're developing a feature film, which is actually nature fighting back the humans, and in the end, nature survives, the human die. And there we're talking. Well, there the director says, Katja, we're not going to make a lot of cinema visitors here, So we need to find a different model, and this is what we're working on at the moment for weeks, day to day, where we're actually trying to find ideas. How can we set it up? How can we find the audience? And this is also before we even send again the application off to get the financing. So we have it in place. What do we want? I didn't answer your question.
With cinema versus, you know.
She says, I think it's a discussion to have early on with your director, because you have to be going in the same direction. You cannot start the trip of making the movie if he wants to do an art house festival film, and we want to go and do a different version of the movie, and then at the end of the day, we have something that nobody wants, and you're and it's also like I think the breaching between the SVOD platform and the festivals, like if we just take The Irishman, that's now playing theater, I think that it's going to change a little bit in the future. I think that they're going to be carving out parts where you can go and you can release in a festival. You can get both, like from both parts. Like you can do the festival circuit because it's limited. Like it's not going to go to millions of people, but it's going to generate a buzz. And then it goes on to the SVOD platform. I think it's going to be more and more. I think that Netflix, for example, is turning an eye towards that because people have been fighting for that for a long time now. And I do understand the director who wants to see it on the big screen and have everybody applaud him or her, and it's a great feeling, you know. But as a producer, you also think about, like, it's an industry. You have to generate money, otherwise you're not going to be able to do your next movie. And if Netflix is paying a lot of money, and then you go to the cinema and nobody goes watch it, but you turn down Netflix, and then the director is working at Bonus on the register, and he could have been doing something else. It's like, I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but like you have to be discussing it early on.
But so how is selling films to theatrical distributors? Are they dying quickly, or how are they doing?
So drastic or dramatic yet, but it's. I wanted to say something in relation to what you said, but now I forgot. So and now I forgot your question.
The question is, you know, in terms of what I mean is theatrical distribution, because we're competing with all the other channels of distribution. I'm asking. How is cinema doing in terms of surviving theatrically speaking?
And now I'm back on track because I don't think that it's really so in danger, but it's thanks to the film festivals. Because so as I mentioned before, the audience is really shifting to festivals. But as long as there are festivals that screen films on the big screen, there will be the possibility for the audience for these films to watch the films on the big screen, and it might also be the only chance to watch the films, because it's not that these SVOD platforms are taking everything, and they are also getting more and more commercial. They at the beginning of Netflix, so they tried to experiment a bit with well, they called it the award-winning films, and then it meant basically art house films. And then they, I think, already now realize that award-winning films can also be commercial. So now it's already dying, this possibility to go with a black and white film, for example. If it's not Roma, it's not given at all to sell it to an SVOD platform. So it will be on the big screen in the festival.
Yeah. But and Ruben Östlund used to be a very tiny filmmaker. Now he's kind of world-renowned, and I'm sure his films sell very well. Or am I imagining that?
No.
But
I'm not the major producer.
Right.
I'm the minor producer in Denmark. Yeah.
A sense of how it's, because it's just an example of an art house filmmaker that starts very small, but yet, it makes still specific and art house films that do somehow cross over to, we can call it the mainstream.
Yeah, and this is what I meant when I said, like, he somehow, I mean, if you look at Ruben Östlund's first feature film and second feature film, they might not have the ingredients that he somehow manages to contribute now to his films, and now Force Majeure, The Square, and the same probably for the next one, they sell very well and somehow cross over from art house to a bigger audience.
Yeah. Do you think that he would reject Netflix? It's hard to say.
No, I don't know about him, but I know the sales agent
Would reject.
I don't know.
I'm not so sure about that. And also, I'm not so sure about the next film of Ruben. So I'm really curious what it will be, because let's not forget that The Square won the Golden Palm, which always helps the films also to grow a bit more than they would if they hadn't. Because he made maybe better films before even, and they were not that as successful as The Square.
So we'll try to win awards then. But do you have any final comments? Anybody? Maybe one or two questions if anybody does have one.
Yeah, this is a great question that I'm very afraid to answer to, because these are exactly the rights that we hate, usually because it's a lot of work. And it's a lot of work for no money at all, and it's also a lot of time, and usually when we work on the educational rights, it's with institutions, organizations that, of course, they do it for a good purpose. But it's always a loss for us, because if it's us who have to pay even for the delivering the material for a screening, it's not something that fits our business model. So usually we give on these educational rights as well to the distributors in the specific territories. So it's the distributors' problem.
Question over here.
So you talked a lot about how your work is selling to distributors, but if you're well intended as a sales agent, which you talked about also, you have a little catalog of films. How do we as filmmakers sell our films to you? Because I guess you're not taking everyone who's contacting you on. How do you pick your films?
Yeah, so this is also a very good question, and also the question at when is a good time to get in touch with a sales company. So of course there are different elements that play in. So first of all, we try to have our lineup a bit balanced, meaning that coming films from different parts of the world, so that we don't have two Scandinavian films, for example, at the same time. So this is one aspect. Then also we don't want to have two comedies at the same time, because automatically they are competing with each other. Then again, in the end, it's really up to the film. So the film should be a strong film, and sometimes there are these waves of fashionable countries, for example. There was the Romanian new wave, there was the Icelandic new wave, where it just became easier to sell those films because they worked very well for a moment, and then it disappears. So this changes all the time. So we try to, of course, follow that very closely. And then there is also topics or subject matters that are sometimes very hot and sometimes not hot at all. So we had this experience, for example, with the refugee crisis in Europe, which was a huge thing. It was all over the place. So we thought, okay, this is something that people will be, and especially distributors will be interested in, because in the end, so for us as sales agents, we don't really care about the the audience. So if there is an audience for the film, this is really the problem of the distributor. For us, it's we have to please the distributors. We have to sell the film to the distributors. So we thought that distributors will be interested in films about refugees. And then it turned out that they didn't really give shit. So it was all for nothing. But so this is also something that comes in. And then once again, the film needs to be somehow outstanding, somehow new. There also sales companies are very different. Some are looking for very commercial films. For us, it's always it should be somehow surprising. It should show you something new of the world, some new I don't know, cultures, some new parts of the world that we don't know. So this is more what we look at than rather than the commercial element in them, I think. And then to just very quickly about at what time, at what stage you should start to get in touch with sales companies. It's for a first-time filmmaker, I would say that you can wait until you have a first rough cut of the film, but then you should not waste more time because no sales company will take your film once it has been shown anywhere in public. So once you have your premiere, so even if it is a local festival, it will be afterwards too late to find a sales company because we really need to be there for this one moment, especially because, as I said before, the world premiere, the very first time the film is being shown is a crucial part of the whole strategy. So so you should, with a first-time filmmaker, I think you can take more time. But once again, you should get to know the sales company before, so calculate that in as well a bit. So it's even if you don't have a project, it's good to get out and start to get in touch with the sales companies, to know more about them and to know which ones you feel more close to and you want to work with.
Okay, if it's is it a quick one? Okay, we only have like a few more minutes, so let's see.
I think it's told again and again that getting the biggest minimum guarantee is more important than the royalties deal. How much would you agree with that?
So the question is to me, right? Because yeah,
it's about minimum guarantee. Which
yeah.
Do you want to explain what that is? Because maybe not everybody knows.
Yes, of course. So the minimum guarantee is something that we pay upfront for the film. So it's an advance, which on the one hand it shows or supposed to show our belief in the film, and on the other hand, it can be part of your financing. So sometimes producers even rely on this minimum guarantee because it's part of the financing plan. But for us, it's always, and I think that here it's very good that we are a small company and we can be very flexible. For us, it's the most important thing is that you can make your film under the best possible conditions. So if the minimum guarantee is something that you rely on because you need to fill that financial gap in order to finish and make the film, then it's completely fine for us to pay for a film up front. Of course, we prepare estimates. So these so-called estimates are we don't share those with anybody, but it's just for us to see what we expect to make with the film, because this is, of course, in the calculation we can see on what level of minimum guarantee we could pay in order not to take a too big risk in advance. Sometimes distributors or sometimes producers don't want a minimum guarantee because they are fully financed, and also because if we pay a minimum guarantee, usually we also ask for a higher sales fee. And then if you don't pay a minimum guarantee, the fee is lower. So if you are fully financed and you believe very strongly in your film and in the success of your film, it's even better for you to not ask for a minimum guarantee and to let the sales company work on a lower commission, because then your returns will be also higher. So it's a bit up to you on what you need and what you ask from the sales company.
Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to Gabor, Katja, David, Omar Ragnarsson, Anna Kristín, Þórður, Zina. We have drinks outside. Thank you all for coming. It's been great.
Kommst du zum Dinner? Ja.
Þetta var flott.